Um, I'm Patrick. I'm an environmental engineer by background, and I co-founded Tracera 3 years ago now, with the vision that non-financial data is as important as financial data, and therefore it needs to be treated with the same level of rigor. And I also am a big believer that the non-financial data that we're gathering will allow us to make better decisions. I'm a capitalist at heart, but I believe in what I call multi-capitalism, which is a multi-dimensional way of seeing capitalism. If you're a business providing returns to your shareholder, but polluting a river, well, that river pollution has a cost, and therefore someone needs to be accountable for it. I'm very lucky today that I'm joined by Sam Shiroff and Vittorio Allegri. Sam and I have been working together for 3 years. He was one of our early design partners and customers who really believed in our vision and has helped us build this company from the ground up. And Vittorio brings in like true expertise and insights from the regulatory affairs and public policy world in Europe. He's actually sitting in Brussels right now, not very far from the EFRAG office, literally in the center of the party. So we're very lucky to have them both. Sam, would you mind starting with an intro, please?
Sure. First of all, thank you for the invitation, Patrick, and thanks to the audience for showing up with what I think is an incredibly interesting, sometimes challenging, and certainly will be occupying a lot of us for the foreseeable future topic. As far as background is concerned, it says 20 years experience. It's closer to 26. And I have been in the sustainability space my entire career, also in Europe, starting the beginning of my career at Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt. I've worked also at Bosch, nonprofit organizations, consulting, tech, retail, and now I lead sustainability at Enersys. Maybe not a household brand, but as one of the world's largest manufacturers of industrial storage, so batteries and services, there's a good chance a lot of you have products that have been transported with a forklift powered by our batteries. Your phone, the data backed up with our energy storage products, and we're in things from submarines to satellites, I like to say. And most assuredly, both as one of the largest industrial storage companies in North America and also in Europe, paying very close attention to how this abbreviation alphabet soup that is the title of this webinar is impacting us and how we prepare for it. So, and over to you, Vittorio.
Thank you, Sam. My name is Vittorio Allegri. I'm a senior director at FTI Consulting. I am sitting in Brussels, leading our EU Sustainable Finance practice. In my day job, I do two things. On the one side, I help companies comply with EU ESG regulations such as CSRD and taxonomy. And on the other side, I help companies engage with regulators and standard setters aiming to inform and shape these regulatory standards. Also, a short background on myself. I started a long time ago as a lobbyist for the banking industry, which is what led me to be involved from the very beginning on the roundtables on the EU taxonomy, the development of the disclosures for capital market participants, and later on at PricewaterhouseCoopers, being very closely involved in the development of the CSRD and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And now building the practice here at FTI, sorry, and yeah, really facing this complex regulatory question on a day-to-day basis. Looking forward to the discussion today, Patrick.
Thank you, Vittorio. Thank you, Sam, so much. Again, very lucky to have you both. Also forgot to mention FTI Consulting is one of our platinum partners, and they have been working with us day in and day out. We're very lucky that Vittorio really is at the heart of these regulatory changes. I get updates from Vittorio almost on daily basis with everything that is happening behind the scenes. So before we jump in, we will share all the material from today. So we will share all the slides. So you don't have to worry about that. It will be in your email inbox, hopefully before the end of the week. Number two is we want to make this very engaging. So please do leave questions in the chat. We will answer most of them today. If we are unable to answer some of them, we will make sure to follow up with some of these questions after the session. The way the session is going to flow today, we will spend around 10 minutes going through the facts. So what we know, what we don't know, presenting the facts as is. And then we're going to spend the remainder of the session. So most of the session will be spent going through your questions and answering them. I know you have a lot on your mind, so we want to make sure that we get to all those questions today. We're going to go through CSRD, CSDDD, and EU taxonomy today. I'm going to give you high level the facts, what we know, and Vittorio and Sam will also add some thoughts to that. Last week we heard from the European Commission and EFRAG, and now we know that around before that change, 50,000 companies in Europe had to comply with CSRD. However, that number now is expected to be closer to 7,000. So that is a pretty massive cut. Also, the threshold for compliance was raised from 150 million turnover to 450 million euro in turnover, and the number of employees was raised from 250 to 1,000. So as you can imagine, pretty massive change. And even though this has not been formalized yet, and it's going through the formalization process, we're expecting it to go through, given the amount of support that this amendment has received. Vittorio, I don't know if you want to add anything to this slide.
Thanks, Patrick. I think one element that is worth underlining here is that the delay is in a separate legal proposal compared to the substance of the changes in the CSRD, CSDDD, and taxonomy, which is basically a attempt by the European Union institutions to accelerate the process so that the companies can know as soon as possible if the delay is in place and how long is this delay, while the political negotiators agree in a much longer timeline for substantial changes such as the scope, which is going to be subject to heavy and long negotiations.
Thank you, Vittorio. On the next slide, we can see also the timeline. We're already receiving a lot of questions. So actually, I'm going to present this slide quickly, and I'm going to present one of the questions that we received from the audience, maybe starting with the timeline. As you can see, there has been a delay for wave 2 and wave 4. Mainly wave 2, actually, companies. For wave 1 companies above threshold, things continue as is. And those are European companies that are public interest companies with more than 1,000 employees. Previously, that was 500 employees. And for those companies, nothing is expected to be changed. However, if you are below that threshold of 1,000 employees, there is a expected change in the regulations where you no longer need to go through the same timeline as the ones above the threshold. For wave 2 companies, which are large European companies that are non-public interest companies, previously this was for above 250 employees. Now the threshold is above 1,000 employees, and there's an expected delay in terms of reporting. Instead of having to report in 2026 for 2025 data, the report will have to go through 2028 for 2027 data. So as you can see, that's a 2-year delay for these types of companies, which represents really the heart of European businesses. A lot of them live in that threshold. And then you have the listed EU SMEs, which was around 70% of the companies that had to comply in the past. And now these companies are no longer mandated to report and will be exempt from mandatory reporting and could potentially go through what we call voluntary reporting. And then for non-EU businesses that are, for example, a North American business like Enersys, well, it really depends a bit more on the legal structure of that company. However, the threshold has been raised. So instead of having 150 million euros in turnover, the threshold now is 450 million euros in turnover. And if you have a EU branch, now it's raised from 40 million to 50 million. However, the timeline still remains the same, where these companies still have to comply in 2029 with 2028 data. Any questions on this? And maybe Vittorio, while we wait for questions, and Sam, anything you would like to add to what I just represented?
Maybe if you let me jump in on the threshold, I'm actually seeing already a question about this, and it's a question I received 1,000 times. So the threshold does not apply only to the EU, nor does it apply only to a single entity. Rather, it applies at the group consolidated level. So if you have a holding company in the European Union, the 1,000 employee is for all of the subsidiaries of that holding company. So this is something important to keep in mind when you look at the new scope.
Yeah. Vittorio, that's a good insight. Maybe one additional question that I got is, what happens if a company is at 900 employees and are expected to hit 1,000 in 2026? Will they be in scope or out of scope, in your opinion?
Yeah, so the threshold applies for 2 consecutive years. So you need to have passed the threshold for 2 consecutive years before you come into the scope. So yeah, it will come into the scope the following year after having passed the threshold on one reporting date, basically.
Got it. And then another question was around wave one companies that are below the threshold. The question was about, do we need to submit a report and then stop,
Yes.
or not? I think that maybe the underlying question behind that question is there's a lot of uncertainty. So that question mark is everything. And actually companies that were in wave one that are between 500 and 1,000 employees are facing a lot of uncertainty. So that's probably why we're having this webinar, and we should definitely double click on that. I don't know, Vittorio, if you have any perspective on what companies should be doing that are between 500 and 1,000 that are part of the wave one.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't take the 1,000 as a given. You have to, for the time being, the best approach is to continue with your readiness, especially if you are like in the wave one, so you are a large listed company, a bank or an insurance firm, and you are already in the regime. Actually, you have already absorbed most of the cost of entering into CSRD reporting, and it might be at that point even less relevant to consider whether you are no more in scope, because it might just be a worse problem if you have been reporting on something and then stop reporting. So these particular companies have the most uncertainty, even though there's significant uncertainty for everyone. But yeah, in the end, once you have done a double materiality assessment and have prioritized the gaps in ESG reporting based on ESRS that makes the most strategic sense for your company, then the rest will come and you will be able to adapt to the new world once you have a more certainty about what is going to happen. Not having done that piece, or having already done it and then stop working on it, would be a major waste, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vittorio. I think maybe to move on and present the 2 other slides, and then we can jump in and start answering all the questions that I see here. The next slide is around CSDDD. I think the key changes for CSDDD that, in my opinion, are number 1 is it's now limited to direct suppliers only versus the entire supply chain. And number 2 is the recurrence or the frequency of the monitoring and reporting has been reduced from 1 year to 5 years, which changes a lot, like the level of effort that a company has to go through in at any typical fiscal year. Victoria, I don't know if there's anything you would like to add to that.
So the CSDDD, I don't want to go into the details. We can go through it during the questions. My only comment is similar to the comment I made before. Just like when it was adopted 2 years ago, the CSDDD is heavily controversial, especially in the European Parliament, but also more broadly within the business community as well. So I expect long and complicated negotiations, especially because this time they are negotiating CSDDD, CSRD, and taxonomy, at least in part, all together. which makes the realm of possible negotiation tactics even larger.
Thank you for that, Vittorio. Next slide and final slide on EU taxonomy. I think high level, if I were to just think about some of the changes that were made. Sorry, just waiting for the next slide. Great. I think on this side, you can see the EU Omnibus details, the impact on certain companies when it comes to EU taxonomy. I think there's still a lot to be done on EU taxonomy. I think the key changes that at least were proposed were around, which companies are mandated, which companies are not, trying to create a bit more structure about companies that have 1,000+ employees and a net turnover for 50 million, hence reducing the number of companies that have to comply with EU taxonomy. Vittorio, anything you'd like to add?
Thank you. I think this is the element of change on taxonomy scope, meaning the scope of reporting companies. But also we should not forget the Commission also is running a sub-work stream within Omnibus about the Taxonomy Disclosures Delegated Act. And I think many people on this call will find interesting that there's a proposal to introduce a materiality threshold for taxonomy reporting, which was not the case until now. So many companies might find themselves doing a very complicated assessment around eligible activity, which might generate a limited percentage of their total revenue. In the future, the Commission has proposed basically to allow to report such eligible activities as non-material if the cumulative value is less than 10% of the revenue of the company, so that the company can actually focus, if it has a significant eligible activity, on assessing that, which will be more interesting for the investors and the stakeholders.
Thank you, Vittorio. Anastasia, on the next slide, I think it's time to start going through the questions, and I would like, at least for the next 40 minutes, for all of you to leave with hopefully less uncertainty and a bit more clarity on what you can start doing or stop doing starting today or tomorrow. Sam, that question is for you. As a corporation that has been impacted by this overnight, one of the questions that we received from Diana is around the fact that these changes won't take immediate effect, which is absolutely correct, Diana. As you stated, this has to go through EP, council, and then basically transport into different national laws, which can take up to 12 months. And it is not one directive, it is a package, and therefore, it will take time. One question for you, Sam, from Diana is, what is your advice on what can companies do in the next 90 days and beyond those 90 days, specifically around, stakeholder engagement, but also communication and moving forward when it comes to certain data collection processes?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's, I think, the most important question, at least for many of us. I mean, we're having a conversation today that my guess is if you don't have deep expertise on this, it sounds like a bunch of words that you probably don't understand, right? So I'd love everybody to imagine that even though they're surrounded by very intelligent and experts and things, most of the people they're working with, if you're working at a company, don't understand this stuff, right? I'm going to read a sentence from an article from yesterday. I've read a lot of these articles. They all have this sentence, which is, now that the Commission has issued its omnibus proposal, no one can say for certain what will precisely happen to the scope and requirements, okay? That's the most important message. I'm going to assume, like us, that you're already preparing for what was going to happen as opposed to what we don't know is going to happen. And I'm going to suggest that uncertainty should lead you not to change your current efforts, in large part because this is such an enormous undertaking. If you have more time to do something that is hard and complex and internally, requires a heavy lift and a lot of communications, be happy. But I wouldn't suggest that if you already are down the path, taking a let's stop now, wait and see, because just in case, and I think it's still possible, some or even all of this will be delayed in some way that we'll still have to do what we're doing, right? Or the delay won't be as long as you expect, or the thresholds won't be as they've initially proposed. What all that means is simply communicate that there's uncertainty in a legislative process. Your senior executives, I guarantee, understand that, because in almost all major regulatory regimes right now, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that focus on what the major hurdles are, get that going, be happy if you have more time. But I would also say, and we can talk about this later, focus on not just the compliance obligations, but maybe what you also can get out of doing all of this. All of this information that we're being asked to report, while some may be for some organizations questionably superfluous, in many circumstances, this cannot just be risk mitigation or compliance, but it can really be opportunity creation. And what that means for your company, it's one of the topics that we try to bring up as often as possible, which is how can we use this information to help us manage better, become more efficient, et cetera. I'll stop there, Patrick, and let you get to the question.
No, thank you, Sam, for that perspective. And I totally agree with what Sam said. First, let's take a step back. There's a lot of uncertainty, and everyone hates uncertainty, right? At the end of the day, this is a very unfortunate event, but at the same time, we can use it as an opportunity, as Sam stated. So I think communicating to your shareholders, communicating to different stakeholders across the company is important, and also coming up with a checklist of things that are no regret activities that you need to do anyway, right? And let me give you some examples. For me, a double materiality assessment is a strategy refresh for your business, right? It is not just a compliance exercise, right? And for 90% plus of businesses, actually doing that DMA and gathering the data that you need to gather for that, beyond that DMA will help you create value for your organization. What does value mean? Well, value in today's definition of value is, EBITDA expansion. It's financial value, which means, reducing cost, reducing risk, increasing your revenue. And I'm a big believer that doing this exercise will yield these outcomes. Now, hopefully in the next few years, the definition of value will expand beyond just financial value. And this is why we're having this conversation. But regardless, doing some of these things will help you create financial value for your organization today. And gathering that data, doing the DMA is step 0, and gathering the data is step 1, regardless of what happens beyond that and given the regulations. Vittorio, this question is for you. And again, I'm also going through some of the questions. Actually, maybe before we go through some of the questions, I'm going to go through some of the questions that we had listed here. In your opinion, what are the pros and cons of EU Omnibus? Who benefits and who faces new challenges in today's world?
Thank you, Patrick. This is a very good question that has different answers depending to who you ask, of course. So on the pro side, starting positive, let's say, I think it can help us put the CSRD into the right framing of a strategic exercise of improvement of, like you said, for your company. So improving risk management, improving overall resilience of your supply chain. While the CSRD so far has unfortunately been too much emphasized the bureaucratic side, which is one of the reasons which has also led ultimately to the omnibus being discussed. On the contrary side, unfortunately, this proposal has the effect of penalizing the front runners, penalizing companies that have responsibly invested in a high quality compliance framework, because they might now feel like they have wasted their investment, which we are trying to send a message that this is not a waste. If you have done it right, it will bring the value down the line. But the messages coming from the EU as an authority, I believe, really undermine the credibility that had been built up around around these ESG regulations. So this would be my answer. There are probably more, but these are the first ones that I would emphasize.
Oh, thank you, Vittorio. And you bring up actually a good point around the strategic benefit of this. At the end of the day, you know, you have to follow the money, right? And if investors are asking for this information, if customers are asking for this information, if consumers are asking for this information, you know, you still need to collect it, right? And let's say you are a portfolio company of a PE fund that is no longer required to comply. Well, the PE fund may still need to comply. The PE fund may still require that data from you. If not, let's say you're going through an IPO or an exit soon. Well, this data is now part of an IPO checklist in different countries. So at the end of the day, the core message is that gathering that data is a no regret activity because it will allow you to unlock value beyond just compliance. And, my bet or my kind of vision of what's happening here is we might move into a more deregulated market. However, I believe that the voluntary market or the need for that data from investors will continue requiring different or customers will continue requiring different companies to provide that data. Sam, maybe one question for you, as a North American business with a massive presence around the world, specifically in the EU and other parts of, APAC, for example,
Mhm.
sitting in your role, which is a very global role, would love to hear a bit more about how you see, regulations in different countries playing out beyond just the EU, right? Like you have to,
Sure.
today, like Japan released the IFRS standard, and we're seeing Canada follow ISSB. So we're seeing a lot of moves globally. Sitting in your shoes, what is the biggest challenge for you navigating that global regulatory landscape?
That's certainly on the not terribly long, but increasingly long list of things that keep me up at night, Patrick. And let me just make one comment, which is in my quarter century of experience, going from a very junior to at least the level where I am now a person, understanding how to communicate to the various internal stakeholders is so incredibly important. Patrick, you just used a ton of financial language. I would say anybody on this call who didn't quite know what you were talking about, you need to learn to understand how Patrick is speaking, because you need to use that language with most of your C-suite in order to communicate to them what you're doing, right? And not use our little lexicon here with all of the various different abbreviations. When it comes to that regulatory challenge, both obligatory from a regular patient standpoint, but also the voluntary one. I'm sure I'm not the only one who gets the questionnaires from 5, 10, 15 different software related to which are almost all the same, but with different words, different requirements, different answers. And, so I'll go back to I made a fun slide with the flags of all the different countries, states, provinces, etc. And then I put an umbrella with the EU over top of it, right? So the upside, if you want to look at it that way, of the incredibly comprehensive CSRD and CSDDD is that it more or less fulfills the obligations of every other regulatory regime, with the caveat that the words you need to use might be different. Okay. And Patrick, the reality is that, with our collaboration and, I'm not going to pitch Tracer here, but, we think that the way that you've approached it is really valuable, which is we put our data, our answers, if you will, in one time. And that, if I had to, or my team had to answer all of these different things in the ways that they needed to and spend time comparing, and I would need to triple or quadruple my staff. The software with a large language model overlay lets you do that. Always need a human in the loop to check it, but I'd much rather be the editor than the author. And frankly, this is how we're doing it. We're saying, hey, reality is let's use the CSRD and the ESRS, right, as the guideline. Let's make sure we're answering those appropriately. And frankly, it will answer all of the other questions, maybe with a couple of exceptions. And that's how we're approaching it. consistently and constantly trying to keep aware of what's going on out there. But up to this point, I have not seen a regulation that is more comprehensive than the CSRD.
Yeah. Thank you, Sam, for that. Like, very, and also we're getting a lot of questions about the UK, for example, and different states in North America. So, Sam, I think I love what you said. I think maybe just to take a step back, and again, this is just my vision, kind of fast forwarding where we're going to be in 3 years. The reality is consumers and customers and investors will require more traceability, right? And at the end of the day, whether you're selling a service or a product, the expectation is that you're able to provide a lot more data behind that service and product beyond the data that you provide today, right? If any of you have bought a flight in the last 12 months, regardless of where you are in the world, whether you're in North America or you're in Europe or you're in APAC, or in Africa, like you will see that airlines have gotten to the point now where they can estimate the CO2 emissions per like mile traveled, right? Imagine and to personally that impacts my decision making on a day-to-day basis. Now, obviously, I don't expect everyone's decision to be impacted by the same variables. However, as you start scaling this into other industries, into products, customers that are being educated will start making different decisions. I have people who are shopping on Amazon every day, and they said, "I wish I could get more data about waste, about CO2 emissions, and that will help me change my decisions, right? Sometimes I don't need this tomorrow if I can wait 3 days and it will help save X tons of CO2 emissions. It will have zero impact on your day-to-day life and it will have a massive impact on the environment. So fast forward 3 to 5 years from now, that data will be required regardless of regulation. It will be needed for decision making, right? Number one. Number two is regardless of, again, unless you're a mining company or you're an oil and gas company, for 90 to 95% of the businesses, this is a value creative exercise. What does that mean? It means if I go buy a company today and I need to save 10 million, I need to expand the EBITDA by $10 million. I have two options: reduce cost or increase revenue, right? And guess what? The data that you're gathering will enable those two things. Cost reduction, example, rethinking your packaging, creating more circularity in your business, rethinking where you're sourcing different products from and whether you can get recycled material or not. That would have rethinking your energy sourcing, right? Moving to renewable energy. All of these things will have a positive impact on cost reduction, price increase or revenue increase. Well, people will pay more or will eventually want to pay more for a product that is more like sustainably sourced. And again, it may not happen today. It is a revolution that I think will take time, but having that data is very important. And finally, maybe the last thing I want to say is something that Sam touched upon. Having a data infrastructure, think of this as your financial data infrastructure, right? If you're a company that has more than 50 million euros in or $50 million in revenue, most likely you have a single source of truth for your financial transactions because you need to go through an audit, right? And that can then be used to repurpose for any report. Well, the same thing is going to happen in the non-financial data. We're having a system of records where your data lives, allowing you to then transpose that data, repurpose that data very seamlessly is the future. And getting started today, regardless of what happens to CSRD, is a must for most businesses, regardless of the sector that you're in.
Yeah, Patrick, I mean, I love what you just said, and I'm going to give very practical examples. Our data is now flowing in for the calendar year, right? We're starting to look at it in depth. We're always trying to monitor what is happening, just to have a notion of what's happening in the background. So two things. The first is we noticed an anomaly in our water use in a particular place where we used to have a lot of people. We don't have as many people there anymore. And all of a sudden the water spiked. So what do we do? Well, first, is it correct? Right. And then we look at the bill. So my team's distributed around the country and people in Europe and all. We're not, this factory is in a state that none of us are in, right? We can't get there. And yet we identified a water leak that was costing us several $1,000s a month. So this may not have been caught for months if we hadn't been carefully monitoring, because it's not so much money, right? There's certain rounding off that you do, but it was enough money to be like, well, hey, here's a chance to find that out. And so that's one very practical. We save money, right? The second thing is more of an analogy. And I think your 3 to 5 year vision is where this heads. I like to think back the first time I got my blood work done. I know this seems like a weird, but stick with me. And you had like 5 values. You know, what's your blood pressure and your HCl cholesterol and your high and low, and right. And then if they were off, you're like, this is a problem. You got to talk to your doctor again. The last time I had it done, I think I got like 35 different values, most of which I had no idea what they were. And there was a range, and this is normal, right? And if one's like at the high or low end, then you go on, you know, go to you're Googling what does that mean? Well, actually, that's only a problem if these other 2 are off too, right? And all of this data, so I don't know, honestly, what the correlations are yet with all of this data. But my guess is that we will also begin to see what is it that impacts your company when those values are a little bit skewed together. What do those correlations mean? And over time, and by the way, if you go back to the financial history, you know, people used to focus on price to earnings ratio for your stock. Now they focus on EBITDA and cash flow. There was a massive shift in the understanding of finance. Our data will begin to create information about the health of a company, both at its macro level as well as at the local level, that will be very, very valuable. And this is one of those things where we go from compliance and risk mitigation to opportunity creation that, frankly, you cannot predict exactly what's going to happen. But my hypothesis is aligned with yours, which is we will start to be able to see these things. And so whether or not we have an extra 2 years to comply with the CSRD, getting started now might actually have an ROI as opposed to those 2 years. You know, do you need to have do you need to spend the money for reasonable assurance? I don't know that one, right? I'm not sure I want to do it unless I have to, but I definitely want the data so that I can start to understand more and more about the health of a given location, the overall ecosystem, my supply chain, etc.
Thank you, Sam. Very powerful indeed and very inspiring. Vittorio, a lot of questions for you, actually. Maybe one question that from Marietta is around, can you estimate if Omnibus will be voted in as it is, or do you expect it as a final outcome with revisions, possibly closer to the original CSRD? And do you have a time estimate for the stop the clock and the revisions on the SRS proposal?
Thank you. Well, this is the crystal ball question. In terms of timing, I think for the stop the clock proposal, we can expect a conclusion between 6 and 9 months, meaning that they might start the final stage of negotiation in September if they are very fast. And then, assuming there is a consensus, they might be able to close it by October or November, which is very late for Wave 2 companies, obviously. In terms of the revisions, I would imagine more like 12 to 18 months for the negotiations, if not longer. Now, where do I think they land when it comes to the final piece of the agreement? I think this will take a lot of discussions because elements that are now not part of the negotiation will most likely be thrown back into the negotiations. And from the lesson of the negotiations of the first CSRD, the question about international standard and European standards and the coexistence of the two, and which one is the global baseline, which I like Samuel earlier was referring the UCSRD as the global de facto baseline that answers all of the questions around the world. But also we have another institutions, the IFRS Foundation with the ISSB aiming to deliver that same objective, and the European Union might want to trade that or adapt how it implements that. There's the audit discussion, which is massive because many companies have actually raised the problem of auditors driving over compliance. which actually has not been addressed by the omnibus proposal. And also we know that the parliament, let's say, does not like the concentration in the audit market for large companies at the moment, and might want to rediscuss how that can be tackled and not replicated in sustainability reporting. So I don't want to make predictions. In terms of the threshold, please let me say that there's not a clear majority at the moment in Parliament in support of removing so many companies from the scope, especially when we look at the whole left side of the Parliament, but also covering the center. They have actually loudly rejected the omnibus in its totality, while even parts of the EPP are not very convinced. And the only possible majority or attempted majority at the moment is that including the extreme right of the parliament, which will even further negotiate things because they might demand things that are unacceptable on all sides. While, yes, it is true that in the council, so what the EU member state governments might want to change, actually we see a relative consensus because they have actually asked the commission to come up with the proposal. So this looks like mainly what Germany, but also other countries wanted. However, we might see a division between, and I saw a question in the chat about this, those countries that have already transposed the CSRD and those countries that have not. And the countries that have already transposed might see a disadvantage into granting too many concessions to companies, to other member states, and giving a disadvantage to their companies who are instead already in a stricter regime. So yeah, lots of variables are going to be involved, let's say.
Thank you. Thank you, Vittorio, for that. Very, very helpful. Maybe before we jump into more questions, just to share some results of polls, and thanks everyone for participating. We have more than 300 attendees from 23 countries in Europe and almost 70% of states in the United States and some in Canada. So thank you all for joining. Another result as well is 80% of you have voted that you will keep doing sustainability work despite EU Omnibus. That provides me with a lot of hope and optimism. So thank you for everyone who voted on that as well. I think maybe moving on to more questions. Perhaps this is for both of you, Sam and Vittorio. Maybe Sam, would love to start with you here. A question from Fabiana Maria is around what is the EU's reasoning behind removing sector-specific standard? Specifically, as a reporting practitioner, Fabiana feels that sector-specific standards is quite helpful. What's the feeling from your stakeholders and network? So maybe Sam would love to hear from you, given the sector that Enersys plays in, and maybe actually while I let Sam answer this, everyone else here attending the session, feel free to throw in your answer on the chat as well about how you're feeling about stakeholders and networks, specifically around the removal of sector-specific standards.
Yeah, this is, I think, this is a tough one. I'll start with the fact that as a battery manufacturer, we're subject to the EU battery legislation. So I would call that one of the mother of all sector-specific standards. And it's enormously transparent in the context of everything we have to do down to the individual product level. So that hasn't affected my company dramatically. It's speculative, I think, to say, why not? And I would definitely be interested in anybody's opinion here. To me, as I have looked at SASB and its 77, at least in my lab, or 78 different sectoral, and then also have worked at many, many different companies. The difficulty is that not every company is so easily boxed into a particular sector. The conditions that you end up having for a given one or another is, I think, very questionable in terms of its value add certainly from a financial perspective, because all it does is increase the regulatory burden. It doesn't say, well, if you're in this sector, you don't have to do things, generally speaking, which if they're going to have sector standards, they should say you don't have to do things as well, which is always additional most of the time. To me, this is, I feel that it's an unnecessary regulatory burden. There may be specific sectors that need this. I'm not going to name them. Our sector apparently is one of those that have been decided, from, I think, also national security perspective and industrial policy perspective. That's what the EU has chosen. Otherwise, I'd certainly be happy to hear, anybody else's perspective, because that's just, my personal opinion.
Thank you, Sam. Vittorio, would love to hear your perspective on this from a regulatory perspective. I was actually expecting the opposite. I was expecting more the EU to double down on sector-specific standards because of how different, a manufacturing company can be from from like a food and beverage company, right, or a restaurant.
Yeah. So I mean, the answer has multiple, let's say, facets. On the one hand, there's the kind of balance between a principle-based approach, which gives a lot of leeway for companies to play around and basically report more what they feel comfortable with, versus a rule-based approach where you have more prescriptive guidance, which helps you to know exactly what you have to do. But on the other hand, if you don't like what you have to do, you don't have an escape to avoid doing that, right? And a little hint of where this discussion was triggered is which one was the first draft sector-specific standard that was put out for consultation. That was the oil and gas sector-specific standard. So you might ask, who was the driver here, which needed more principle-based and less rule-based approach to sustainability reporting?
Thank you, Vittorio. Cecilia, if you don't mind going back to the slide with the timeline of CSRD, I'm seeing a lot of questions on, maybe the next slide on that. Specifically, one of the questions is around, what happens for companies outside of the EU that may have presence in the EU. Maybe some of the questions that were asked here. Number one question is, we are a Swiss company. We have more than 1,000 employees. However, all of subsidiaries have less than 1,000 employees, and they are in the European countries. Like, what happens for a Swiss group, Vittorio?
So it's hard to say based on this information, because you always need to look at the ownership chart of the group, and depending on which subsidiary owns which sub-subsidiaries, the answer might change. So yeah, you really need to look at my advice is identify the highest level, the highest consolidation level that's in a European member state, and start from there. Trace all of the subsidiaries of that entity, and then you have to work your way through the thresholds.
Got it. Thank you, Vittorio. Maybe before we move on to a few more questions, just one thing I would like to highlight is, if there's maybe three things I would like you all to leave today. Like, number one, there's a lot of uncertainty ahead. That, I hope you can come out of this session with a list of no regret activities that you can start doing regardless. Number two is the importance of communication, whether it's internally or externally, and stakeholder engagement, because, I think with that many changes ahead that are expected, I'm sure people have a lot of questions that may impact their day to day. So if any of you need any help, we're here to support. Number three is the importance of this data beyond just compliance, to be able to create value, however value is defined today. That definition may change in the future, but every single business should have its own, value creation like framework. Understanding that deeply and understanding how this data can power those decisions and enable value creation is very important. Finally, underlying all these three is the importance of building a system of records, investing in having a data infrastructure. And whether you want to use a system like Tracera or another system, it doesn't matter as long as you find a provider or build your own system where you can have that data in-house that you can then use in the future for any reporting or any decision to be made, right? The beautiful thing about doing that is regardless of what happens to any reporting framework or any regulations, you're still set because you have a ledger of verifiable data that will be able to allow you to enable that. At Tracera, we're helping manufacturing, real estate, and construction companies with that. And I'm sure there are many other systems out there that can help you with that as well. Maybe here, question for you, Vittorio, as well, is this is from a actually maybe for you, Sam. This is for a large like PIC company, and the question is around maybe for you at Enersys, Sam. Um, is the reporting expected in 2028 for 2027 data? And how this proposal could potentially change for like the Enersys timeline and requirements specifically?
Yeah, so I think what's important to say is, I mean, I love the no regret decisions or no regret ways forward. And we're obligation was in wave two. We've already started the process so that even though we're a US based company, a lot of our competitors are in Europe. So we want to make sure that even if we weren't obligated to put out a report, that our customers are aware of it. That goes back to our previous conversation, right? If we have this delay, at the moment, as I mentioned up front, we're not making any adjustments because we don't know what's going to happen. If we have a delay, that might enable us to go a little more slowly, handhold some of the laggards that in terms of getting the information, but it's only a delay and it's not going to stop it. We might put off more expensive auditing processes. Oh, by the way, I did see somebody concerned about limited versus reasonable assurance, and I think that's a cost topic, right? And it's putting in place controls and if you have an internal audit team to help you with that, if not, you might get somebody to help you externally, is a smart thing to do anyway. Why would you not want your data to be accurate? If you're worried about somebody delivering you data that's fraudulent, that's a different topic, right? That's something where you need to bring your legal and compliance team in because that's not something that's permitted, especially if they know that it's fraudulent, right? And it's so there's a lot of things that go in here. Patrick, what I was going through my head and I've had some of this otherwise, these conversations is, first of all, we're talking about companies here. And remember, your company's job, what your company there is to make money. Okay. You are part of that company and therefore that's your job as well. Right. And ultimately your job as a sustainability leader is actually getting stuff done with a sustainability overlay, right? And the getting stuff done, that's what an executive or a leader is responsible for in any company. It's with the sustainability overlay. So how do you get the things done that lead back to that profitability? And obviously risk mitigation compliance are part of enabling all that. How do you do that at the same time as you're fulfilling these obligations? And I really think like the delays are potentially welcome because the execution is so onerous. Asking me not to do things that make no sense, I'm also happy to not do those, right? But one way or the other, we're going to have to do most of what's here. And so my advice and my counsel to my own organization is let's keep going in a way that's clear and makes sense for our company, that gets us where we need to be, aligned with all of our stakeholder expectations. And regulators are just one of those stakeholders. Customers are there, employees are there, the communities are there, right? And a lot of what this is about is making sure that you're doing the right thing and you have an awareness of the impact of your organization. And I think that's just a good thing to do, but helping to understand why that also can be a profitable thing to do is the challenge that we all face. And this is just a good stimulation of that discussion.
So, Sam, I think you touched upon two great points. Like number one, I totally agree with you. I think I've been working with companies in and out for the last like 2 years on this topic, and I'm seeing a lot of them leaning towards potentially over-reporting or over-compliance because of the lack of clarity. And also for some of them, they were very crunched on time, and therefore because of that this exercise was very stressful. So actually more time can give you really a bit more time to do this, not just to check the box, but to think beyond that and do it properly by engaging the right stakeholders from day one. So I loved your perspective here. I'm seeing a lot more questions. I don't think we'll be able to answer all of them. However, what I will do is I will make sure to follow up with all of you individually to answer the questions that you asked if we're not able to answer it. Also, we're going to have two more webinars, one on the assurance process. So we will make sure to invite some of you who are interested in that. And number two is on regulations beyond the European Union. I'm seeing a lot of questions about the UK and SCCR and the impact of how the UK will also react to some of the changes that the EU has enacted. Perhaps given that we only have a few more minutes, Vittorio, Sam, I would love to ask like a concluding question, maybe like starting with you, Vittorio. And maybe it's a bit more of a vague question, but really would love to hear your open-ended answer. You know, 2 years from now, um, where do you think this world will be? How will companies be, thinking of regulations, data, sustainability more broadly? What's your vision or perspective on that?
Thank you, Patrick. I think so. The fact that you already today have a significant amount of very large companies which have a global influence, reporting and using ESRS as a reference framework for their sustainability strategies. Eventually, year over year, will expand regardless of regulatory requirements, just for the capacity of these large kind of giants to influence their ecosystem. Therefore, my expectation is that there is going to be a natural convergence, just like we have seen in the field of financial reporting over a 50 years time frame. But this time will be much faster. And even if the omnibus will allow smaller companies to take their time, let's say, to adapt into this new world, the new world is coming anyway. So that's what I would answer.
Thank you, Vittorio. Sam would love to hear your perspective, maybe also from the perspective of your kids, right, who are soon to become adults and making financial decisions as well. Would love to hear your perspective on that.
I mean, so I agree with what Vittorio said, which is look back to the history of financial reporting and see, we weren't in the place that we currently are, 50 years ago, and certainly not, the advent of modern financial reporting in the almost 100 years ago. This is a change management topic, right? Just at a very high level, we're all being asked to do something we hadn't previously done. From a sustainability perspective, it is the culmination of decades of work. It might be a little bit more than makes sense. That's not unusual, right? And the way these things, the way laws are made, right? It's the sausage making process, and we're still in the sausage making process, and we're having a conversation about ingredients right now. I think that we will have greater clarity. I think there will be additional hiccups, but I also think that there will be a core group of organizations that can demonstrate where they go from risk mitigation to opportunity creation. And I would add, all with a nice AI overlay that will create insights that we are not yet sure what that's going to be, right? And it makes me an optimist in that context. I can see some downsides to the AI, but if you can get the data that you're collecting together with some of your other content and data and start to try to generate new ways of looking at it that no person probably could do, I think that there's some there, right? That's very speculative. I could be completely wrong. But like I said, I'm looking at this as an opportunity. I welcome having more time simply because it's so challenging. At the same time, I think that there's a lot of really, really good substance that is important for more and more companies that enable us to make more sustainable decisions, right? And, if you asked about my kids, yeah, right. And, I want grandkids someday too. I'm way off from that, but it's still right. That's what sustainability is supposed to be all about, which is, leaving ecosystems and societies that are as good or not better for future generations, right? And so, I mean, try to keep that big picture while at the same time focusing on what our jobs are, which is facilitating the success of our organizations.
Thank you so much, Sam. Vittorio, Sam, very inspiring indeed. And thank you again for making the time. I know we're 2 minutes over, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. Maybe just first, I want to thank again Vittorio and Sam for making time and taking time from their busy days to be here. Extremely informative session. I know we barely got to 10% of the questions. So for anyone, again, where the question hasn't been answered, we will follow up. And please feel free to reach out to me. For the audience, thank you for making the time out of your very busy day. Maybe as we wrap up, I would love to turn the attention towards you in the last minute here. If you all want to type in the chat, either how you're feeling coming out of this conversation or any other advice that you have for all the other participants in the room, just feel free to write it. We will just wait for a minute before we wrap this up and give you all time back. I'm going to write mine, which is positive momentum. Right? Seems my experiment failed. Anything else that you need, just feel free to type it. Again, thanks again for joining. Vittorio, Sam, any final words while we give everyone time back?
Hey, if people want to contact or get in touch on LinkedIn, we're still a fairly small community, and we're all here to help each other.
Love that. Vittorio.
Thank you, Patrick. I just want to thank everybody for holding through a 1 hour of acronym and technical ESG regulations. We very much appreciate. I very much appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Patrick.